Hi, this is Andy. There's a classic question that is often asked somewhere during a job interview. It goes something like this. So, what's your biggest weakness? So perhaps you've been asked that somewhere along your career journey, but my favorite answer to this is from Michael Scott in the television show The Office. He goes, I work too hard, I care too much, and sometimes I can be too invested in my job. Right? Perfect, right? Oh, wait, did I say perfect? I did, because in a sense, the answer that Michael gave there is what a lot of us admit to being one of our biggest weaknesses. We struggle with being a perfectionist. It's like one of those flaws that when you admit it, people knowingly, tilt their head and nod and say, yes, I understand, me too. It's a socially accepted flaw that we might even think has some hidden advantages in driving us to higher performance. But if you think that, you would be wrong, at least about the higher performance part. And I know that because I read Thomas Curran's new book, The Perfection Trap, Embracing the Power of Good Enough. It's a book that will challenge your thinking about perfectionism and, if you let it, begin to free you from the ways that it might be hurting you, your mental health, your relationships, and your performance far more than you realize. In this discussion with Thomas, you'll learn from one of the foremost researchers on this topic about misconceptions people have about perfectionism. Thomas will explain the three categories or dimensions that can drive perfectionism in our lives. You'll learn how much of this is nature versus nurture, which is going to have some surprises in there for you. And before we're done, Thomas will share some specific things that you can do to help yourself, help you as a leader of teams, and if you're a parent, some ideas to mitigate raising another generation of perfectionists. It's a discussion I've been waiting to share with you for a long time now. Before we start, this issue of perfectionism is so real with those in college or recently graduated. It's as if they're supposed to have the perfect career plan in place when, in fact, they know they don't. So many dread being asked the question, so what's your career plan? Because when it comes to their career, they have no freaking idea. And I bring this up because we have a new course entitled just that, No Freaking Idea, How to Navigate Career Uncertainty. It's a career guide specifically designed for people who are struggling with uncertainty about what they want to do. And to the topic of today's episode, it doesn't promise you at the end of the course to give you a perfect career plan somehow to live your best life. In fact, what learners have been telling us so far is that it calms them down. They're realizing that they don't have to have a perfect plan because it doesn't exist. It helps them take the next step in an empowering way instead of being shamed into taking something just because it'll make a lot of money. The feedback on the course has been so heartwarming. So whether you enroll to help you think through next steps in your career, or you want to gift a license to a son or daughter or someone else learn more by going to nofreakingidea.peopleandprojectspodcast.com. Thanks. Well, let's jump into today's discussion with Thomas about his book, The Perfection Trap. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thank you for having me, Andy.
Nearly every researcher we've had on the podcast admits that their research was in some ways really me search. And that's true for you, right? So where would you say you are on this whole perfectionist journey today, which I suppose is another way of asking, does a perfectionist ever stop being a perfectionist?
Certainly is me search. Yeah, I am a perfectionistic person. I certainly carry around me perfectionistic traits. Look, I'm in recovery, I would say. I am able to manage those traits in ways that are way healthier than I used to. But nevertheless, this is a characteristic that those who suffer from it carry around with them a lot. And I think, it's a journey, right? And I think I'll get there. But at the moment, it's a case of reflection, working with those inner drives, working to try to kind of recalibrate those goals a little bit, trying to be less harsh on myself. All of these things I work on all the time, and writing the book has actually been quite helpful in that respect too, because it's been really clarifying in terms of what perfectionism is, what it really does to us, how it impacts us, and what are the best ways out.
We had Vanessa Patrick on to talk about her book, The Power of Saying No, and she goes, stop saying that you're a people pleaser because it becomes part of your identity. And I wonder, I really admire something you just said. Part of what you said was, I have perfectionistic traits, I think you said, or tendencies. And I think there's something powerful about not making it, this is my identity, Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, this is really, so that is that's such an important point, Andy, because perfectionistic people, and you'll hear this a lot, will, and I was certainly used to say this to myself, that perfection was a part of me, it was part of my identity, and it was the one thing holding me up when everything and all around me seemed like it was coming down, right? Perfectionism was the thing keeping me moving forward. It was what I hung on to. I wore it as a badge of honor. It was a way of moving about the world, trying to overcome, push through the issues that I was experiencing. And so in that respect, I very much wore it on my sleeve. And having been able to recognize through my own research, through my own self-reflection, and through support with professionals, I've been able to see that actually it was a perfectionism that was causing the problems in the first place.
Ironic.
So this kind of epiphany, so to speak, has allowed me to think about perfection in a different way. Has really taught me a lot about myself and about what perfectionism really is. And as a consequence, it's helped me to realize that these are tendencies, these are traits. These are things that we all fall into. We'll all slip into that sort of self-critical mindset. All of us at some point in our lives will feel victim to that kind of intense and pressurized drive to do something really, really well and make that kind of a really important thing for our self-esteem. This is something we all do, but it's important to recognize that these things are part of our perfectionism. They're not necessarily what's helping us. It's certainly not what's holding us up in the world, and ultimately they're pulling us back. And I think that's why I try to talk about these things in terms of tendencies, traits, because then they can be managed more easily.
I like it. And we'll talk about what it is, but I think it's helpful to know what it's not. So what are some top myths or misconceptions that people have about perfectionism? Like, what is it not?
So a lot of people think perfectionism is high standards.
Okay.
I think this is the big one. Yeah. They'll say, perfectionistic people have high standards that define them as perfectionists. But actually, perfectionism is way deeper than just high standards. So, conscientious people have high standards. Diligent people have high standards. They come from a very active, optimistic sense of trying to improve, trying to do better. That's not what perfectionism is. Perfectionism at root comes from a place of deficit, a place of lack, a place of feeling less than. And all of those intense self-imposed pressures, all of that self-criticism, all of that need to conceal and hide is really a way of managing shame-based fears of not feeling like we're enough, not feeling like we're perfect enough, going through the world at defensive mode, trying to essentially prove to yourself but also other people around you that you're not flawed, that you're not deficient, and gain at all times validation and approval from people, sometimes people you don't even know. And this is the difference and the key difference between the high standards, the conscientious person, and the perfectionist, who's really engaging in these behaviors from a place of lack. And that's really important to bear in mind. And I think that's the biggest perfectionism myth. There are others we can talk about. For instance, the successful perfectionist myth, and maybe we'll talk about that. We could talk about that at the moment. But and the fact that perfectionism is something that is on the wane. That's to say, young people are becoming more fragile, more vulnerable. That's also a myth. That's not the case either. But the biggest one is that perfectionistic people are characterized by high standards. They're characterized by lack and deficit.
Yeah. Or somehow leads us, like you said, to success. Here's I guess if I had to get some core messages from the book and test me out here to see how well I did, was perfectionism is relational. It's destructive to our mental health. It has no relationship with success, and it's getting worse. Okay, so first of all, how did I do? And secondly, let's talk about that relational part. Like, what do you mean that perfectionism is relational?
That's so crucial. So perfectionism, a lot of people think perfectionism comes from within, this kind of high self-set drives, and I guess when we conjure an image of perfectionist in our minds, that's what we see, the quintessential overstriver. But perfectionism, like all other personality characteristics, doesn't operate in a vacuum. And we live in a social world. And the reason why we're putting ourselves through the ringer in such an intense way is for other people's love and approval. For other people to communicate to us that we matter and that we're worth something. And that's why perfectionism is such an intently relational trait. Because on the surface, it looks like all of this bundle of energy but actually underneath is a fragile sense of self-esteem that's tied primarily to what other people think and say. And as soon as we receive rejection, critical feedback, or worse, indifference, then that self-esteem is shattered. We feel worse about ourselves, we feel very low, get a lot of anxiety and worry, and then we overcompensate by striving even harder to try and soothe those self-conscious emotions, self-conscious feeling like shame and guilt, and you can begin to see how that cycle starts to accelerate. So that's why it's so intently relational.
Yeah. I found it helpful personally to learn about the drivers of perfectionism, the self-oriented, the others, and the socially prescribed. And we'll talk about the socially prescribed one in a little bit. But for now, how do you like to describe the self and others-oriented dimensions? And how have you found those expressed in your own life?
Yeah, so self is the dimension of perfectionism that comes from within. So over many, many decades of work that's been done by colleagues other than myself, who've done a lot of the heavy lifting in this area, trying to develop a broad theory of what perfectionism is. And if you talk to perfectionistic people, you'll often hear them talk about self-oriented, so this kind of high self-set imposed drive to do perfect things and nothing but perfect things all the time. This is self-oriented perfectionism. But they also, interestingly enough, talk about other areas of perfectionism that come from outside of themselves, and one of them is other-oriented perfectionism. So not only do they put themselves through those excessive pressures and expect excessively high standards of themselves, but also they project those standards onto other people too. This is called other-oriented perfectionism. So what you sometimes see in perfectionistic people is very demanding, unrealistic expectations that are placed on people around them, and they're very punitive, they're very critical when people haven't lived up to those standards. And in myself, I certainly relate to self-oriented perfectionism. I would say I haven't necessarily always found myself in the trap of other-oriented perfectionism, but I've certainly been around other-oriented perfectionists, and they're unmistakable when you're in their company, because they can be really difficult to work with, because essentially nothing is ever quite good enough, and no matter how well you do, there's always something more, there's always something better, there's always the next target to go on to, and you never really get a sense of unqualified praise for anything that you've done. And I'm sure your listeners can relate to people who are like that. And so that self-oriented, a kind of high self-set, and other-oriented, projecting those high self-set standards on other people. It's important to recognize, though, it's a spectrum, right? So you can be high or lower in the middle of self, and higher or lower in the middle of other, and everyone has their own kind of constellation of traits, or where they sit on each spectrum, and so there's no one size fits all, essentially.
This is probably not fair to ask, but I feel like in some ways it's not if it's not if I'm here on the scale, it's when I'm here on the scale. Like in this context, I may be really high on the self, but in this context, it's less, right? So I'm not a number on the spectrum. I'm somewhere, I don't know, is there any research backing it? It's not if you are here, it's when you're here? Any thoughts?
Absolutely, no, 100%. So I think the best way to think about it is what in our mind's eye is our idealized self. Like who is it that we want to project into the world? Who is that person that we feel like we should be in our workplace, in our relationships, in our social life? And once you identify that idealized image of yourself, or at least who in your mind's eye you feel like it would be you aspire to be, I suppose we should say, then you can begin to see what are going to be the trigger points for your perfectionism. So if you want to be, let's take myself, I want to be a perfectly erudite professor who knows exactly what he's talking about. Yeah, authoritative, knows his stuff and all the rest of it. That's my kind of idealized image. So of course in the workplace, if I don't quite hit those standards, let's say I give a bad lecture or don't answer a question optimally, then that's when perfectionism is going to really have an impact. When self-criticism comes in, that's when that's when you're higher on, as you mentioned earlier, higher on the self-oriented perfectionism in those contexts, because it's really latching on to that idealized image that you pin so much of your self-esteem to. Now, of course, in other areas of life, it's not so important. So if I go and play five-a-side football and I miss a penalty, right. Well, I can deal with that a lot easily, because that's not part of my identity, right? Like that's just an area of life where I'm doing something at leisure or for fun or whatever. So Yeah, you're absolutely right. We'll have an idealized image, and wherever that idealized image is placed, our self-esteem will be pinned. And if we make a mistake in that context, our perfectionism can really have an impact. But outside of
Yeah.
those contexts, it's less severe.
That makes sense. When I was reading about the self, I thought of the imposter syndrome a lot. About I just don't live up enough. And you talked about some people who are very accomplished, who just could. It's almost like they could never recognize their achievements. And then I tell you, Thomas, I had to reflect. There's times where someone might compliment me, and I would deflect or diminish it. And now I just try to say thank you. That's just a small little way, but is that a reflection of sometimes of the self driven that we just can't recognize our accomplishments, or we diminish them or deflect them?
Yes, because perfectionism at root, as I mentioned, is it's kind of, if you can think about it like this, and it's an escape from ourselves. We know deep down that we're flawed, exhaustible, imperfect. We know that deep down. But what we're trying to do is project into the world a perfect version of ourselves. That, we're competent, we're hyper functional, and all the rest of it. Now, this creates a lot of inattention because, on the one hand, we're trying to be somebody we're not somebody perfect, and on the other hand, we know deep down that we're imperfect, and we're trying to conceal and hide this imperfect person from everyone and all around us. So, of course, that's going to create lots of thoughts of imposterism, lots of thoughts that we're not quite in the right place, that we don't belong here, that we're not good enough. Remember, that's a signature of the perfection. And as a consequence, can lead to a lot of apprehension, a lot of anxiety, this kind of idea, fake it till you make it. This is a very common thing that young people say these days, essentially, because it's an expression of that kind of apprehension that deep down they know they're not quite good enough, but they're going to have to project into the world some idealized version of themselves, at least for a little while, to overcome some of those feelings of imposterism. And again, that comes from a place of needing to be perfect, wanting to be perfect, feeling that we're not good enough in this moment, and having to constantly do more, be more, have more in order to compensate for those feelings. And so imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon is very, very strongly tied to perfectionism.
Yeah. I think at some level, I think a lot of people have this belief there's this healthy perfectionism and the unhealthy kind. No thanks to Don Hamichuk or whatever that guy's name is. I now know differently because I read your book. But what about the person listening to us that thinks, well, wait, Thomas, in order to get ahead in this world, can't it help a little bit? I mean, so what's your response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I hear this a lot. And this is really interesting because a lot of people think this, and actually before we did a lot of the research in this area, we thought this too. We know perfectionists spend a lot of time on task. We know that. They're intensely rigorous workers. In fact, there's correlation between perfectionism and things like workaholism. So we know that they work so hard. But what's really interesting is they can't seem to turn that hard work into performance, because study after study shows that there's weak to non-existent relationships between perfectionism and performance, especially interestingly in the workplace. So what explains that paradox? Well, there are two reasons. Perfectionists work hard, but they work unsustainably hard, right? So they sacrifice other areas of their lives, like good diet, good sleep, rest, time with family, time with friends. These are very rejuvenating, vitalizing activities. And as a consequence, they tend to feel very exhausted. They put in too much. They go above and beyond, way beyond comfort. They fall into that kind of trap of burnout, and they start to see a lot of exhaustion, cynicism, and reduced accomplishment creep into their lives. So clearly, those things are not conducive to high performance. But there's a second reason, which is, I think, more interesting than the burnout explanation, and that is perfectionistic people are world-class self-sabotagers. And they will avoid failure so intently that they'll sabotage their chances of success just to make sure that they don't fail. How do we know this? Well, we've seen it in lab study after lab study. And I'll give you an example of a lab study that's really illuminating. So we often use the conduit sport because sports are a really interesting context to examine these effects, particularly failure. What happens when we put people in situations of challenge and failure? So we get people in the lab typically, and we measure their fitness in a sham fitness test, and on a bike, and we give them a goal. We say, well, based on your fitness, you should comfortably cover this amount of distance in this amount of time. Should be comfortable for you. So go away and do it. And then all of the participants would work so hard to meet this goal. And then at the end, no matter how well they did, we said, you failed. You didn't quite meet the target, which is a bit naughty. Yeah. And often there's a lot of swearing involved at that moment in time. However, we'd also do something even naughtier and say, but don't worry, you got another chance. Have another go. It's okay. And this is when something remarkable happens. So the people who score lower on perfectionism, on the second attempt after the first failure, they don't really change their effort. In fact, if anything, they give a little bit more on the second attempt. But the participants who score high on perfectionism do completely the opposite. Their effort falls off a cliff. Because you can't fail at something you didn't try.
There you go.
And their feelings of embarrassment, shame, guilt, of encountering that failure, feeling so inadequate in that moment of defeat, is so intense that they'll just sabotage the chances of success the next time round to avoid feeling those things again. And so they tend to avoid. They tend to withdraw when challenging it comes into their lives. They procrastinate. This is the classic procrastination problem of the perfectionist. What they're really doing is managing their anxiety, not their time here, because the task is so big and difficult that they just want to avoid themselves from feeling those difficult emotions that are associated with something that's going to be so challenging to complete. And of course, they're just damaging themselves by the passage of time. And this is not at all conducive to high performance either. So this is what's happening here. Whenever someone says, yes, but don't we need perfectionism in our lives to be successful? Well, the data doesn't indicate that that's the case. And that's because it's unsustainably hard work combined with a lot of withdrawal, avoidance, procrastination when things get tough.
I was somewhat attracted to, is it Gaudreau?
Gaudreau, yeah.
Yeah, Gaudreau. That curve that there's diminishing returns. I thought, okay, so maybe it's going to help me a little bit. But what I took away from your book is neat idea, but it doesn't turn off. Right?
Exactly.
That's kind of that.
Well, it's like anything in moderation, right? Like putting yourself in, investing yourself in tasks clearly is going to have positive impacts on performance, right? Just showing up is so important. But at the same time, we have to bear in mind that we're exhaustible creatures, and our resources are not limitless. And there will come a point at which we're putting in so much effort that we're compromising other areas of our sleep. And so any additional effort in that task beyond what's comfortable starts to have diminishing returns. And then if you go above and beyond that threshold, then you'll get inverse returns, okay? Because you're being sloppy, you're tired, you're not thinking straight, you're iterating and editing well beyond what's needed, and then your work's becoming compromised as a result. So Patrick Gaudreau's, I really like Patrick Gaudreau's perspective on the inverse U relationship between perfection and performance, and this idea that they just go way, way too far at the expense of their performance.
And this kind of reminds me of even your family situation, because I love how you talk about your grandfather. He strove for excellence, but it wasn't a perfectionism excellence. And I remember your dad from the cleaning up story that, okay, was good enough, and maybe there's excellence in other areas, but you talked about your mom being the perfectionist, which does make me wonder, how would you explain the role of nature versus nurture when it comes to where we are on these scales?
Absolutely. It's something that I think we have to recognize in all personality characteristics, and the data is very clear about this. And it's not that well known, but it's important people understand that how we are in terms of our characteristics and our personality is very heavily determined by our genetics. About 50% of personality is genetically inherited. That's a lot.
I don't want to believe that. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to believe that.
I know, but there's nothing we can do about it, and unfortunately, we're just predestined. We're born with a certain characteristic, in our blood and in our bones, and that's just the way it is. And and perfectionism is no different. It's slightly less than 50%. It's about 30 to 40%, but nevertheless, it's a huge amount of perfectionism between me, you, and anyone else. Between person differences, about 30 to 40% is explained by perfectionism. So there's a huge genetic component to this, and I've no doubt that my mother, who is a meticulous, diligent, cross every I, dot every I, cross every T, perfectionistic person. I'm sure that there's a lot of her in myself. And actually, I would say, Andy, the more I reflect on that, I think there's something remarkably comforting about that, because perfectionists want control all the time. They want to feel like they're in control of the way they are, the way they behave, the way they act. And I think it's something remarkably comforting about understanding that actually some things, like our personality, our characteristics, are simply out of our control. There was nothing we could do about that. And actually reflecting on that is quite comforting, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, because you give no room for victimhood in the book, but understanding that, like you said, it can be kind of comforting. And it is only 50%, even though that's a lot. I mean, there is some responsibility for the other part of it. And,
yeah, exactly. And that was the second part of my book, right? Like, yes,
right.
okay, 50%, 40, 30, 50% is a lot, but that still leaves quite a bit for the environment to explore.
Yeah, right. I'd love to talk about the socially prescribed dimension because I feel like part of me thought, well, that's obvious. And yet, after reading it, I just feel like it's so much more insidious than what I realized. So what are some examples of how our perfectionism is driven socially?
Socially prescribed perfectionism is the third component of perfectionism along self-oriented and other-oriented that we described earlier. And socially prescribed perfectionism is the most insidious form of perfectionism because it comes from outside of us. And you'll often hear perfectionistic people talk about how not only they have high self-imposed standards, but they feel like everybody and all around them expects them to be perfect. And that they're watching and they're waiting and they're judging to pounce on whenever we've revealed a chink in the armory. And it's the most extreme form of perfectionism because what it does is it teaches us that we simply can't step out of line. We're under the microscope all the time. And every time we reveal some shortcoming or deficiency, that we're being judged and we're being watched. And this is why it's so difficult to deal with failure for perfectionistic people, because especially public failure, because they've just exposed a chink and a flaw and an imperfection to other people, and that has said something about them, that they're not worthy, they're not good enough, that they are this imperfect person that deep down they believe they are. And so it's really problematic. And one of the things in the book that I really want to drive home is that not only is socially prescribed perfectionism makes it really difficult, particularly for psychological mental health, but also it's rising. We're seeing really high and rising levels of socially prescribed perfectionism right now among young people. It's on an exponential upward growth trajectory, which means it's still rising and rising really, really fast. And when you think about some of the things I just said about how insidious this form of perfectionism can be, that really should be cause for concern.
Mm-hmm. A phrase that I just can't shake since reading your book is the tyrannies of should. And so I'm trying to pay more attention to when I say should, because that doesn't mean I shouldn't do it. It's not to rebel as much as, to me, that's one of the triggers. Am I doing this because would you mind just unpacking that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So Karen Horney was a master clinician back in the 40s, 50s and 60s, and she was really the pioneer in perfectionism work. She was the first one to identify perfectionism as a personality characteristic that seemed to be a common thread among the patients that she was seeing. And she identified it as really a what she called a cultural neurosis. And she was really adamant that this is something that comes from culture, something that comes from outside of us, and it's really being driven by what she called tyrannical shoulds. So in the outside world, in society, what we see and what we're bombarded with is a set of strict standards and expectations that we feel like we should be held to, whether that be expectations in what we should own, how we should look, how we should behave, where we should be in our professional lives, how productive we should be, and all the rest of it, what diet we should eat. All of these shoulds are fired at us all the time, and they create in us a sense that in order to live a happy and contented life, we need to be this person that society tells us we should be. And this again goes back to what I was saying earlier about this kind of sense of alienation, that we're trying to be something we feel like we should be, which is taking us away from who we really are. And Horney was really very keen to stress that this creates a lot of difficulties. It creates a sense that we must be an idealized person. We have this idealized image and we have to shoot for it. And this creates a lot of inner tension, a lot of inner conflict, and therefore a lot of psychological difficulty. And really her ideas are prophetic if you want to understand what's happening in the present day, because the tyrannies of should have really expanded. They're reaching into almost every area of our life, particularly with the advent of social media and how images of perfect lives and lifestyles are projected to us 24/7, how we should look, what we should have, how we should behave, what diet we should be on, what fitness regime we should be taking, and all the rest of it. All of these things are just everywhere right now, and it's really difficult to escape them. And of course, inevitably, they're going to create in us a sense of tension and conflict. Like, this is who we should be. Everybody else is this perfect person who has a perfect life and a perfect lifestyle, and I don't have those things. And as a consequence, I should do X, Y, Z in order to live the same life. And I think those tyrannies of should are really. I think that was an important breakthrough in terms of our understanding perfectionism. But I think it's really, really no more important than it is today when thinking about why it is that we have these rising levels of socially prescribed perfectionism.
So I want to ask you, what should we do with social media now? But that would be wrong. Okay, so that'd be a turn. So how do you personally interface with social media based on what you know now?
Yeah, I think I'm not a massive user of social media, so I came through at the probably like the kind of last generation that didn't have social media everywhere. If I was a few years later down the line, I'm sure it would have been a different story. So I'm not a massive user of social media, but I do have a Twitter account. I did have an Instagram account. I do have a LinkedIn account. So I am like on those platforms. And I actually think they're very extraordinarily powerful tools. And actually, if we could use them in the right way, like for the right reasons, they could be incredibly life enhancing. If we can use them to bring us together over shared interests, to share and create content, to enhance offline relationships, right? Like sort of get people together outside of these platforms. As you know, these are kind of, by the way, these were the original aims of social media, social networks in the truest sense. This is what they were intended to do. Then it has so much value. Unfortunately, we don't use them in those ways predominantly. We use them to compare and consume. Targeted advertising is really the main revenue stream for these platforms, and so the incentive is to keep us on there. They're addictive by design, and as a consequence, we kind of inside this hall of mirrors of limitless perfection that makes us feel miserable about ourselves, and that's obviously not a healthy way to use social media. So I think my opinion on social media is just it is driving this perfectionism epidemic. But at the same time, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think it has tremendous value. We just have to try and use it in ways that contribute to our lives rather than dim them.
This is a small thing, but here's what I'm trying to like trigger, like stimulus response. So stimulus is I feel a little bit of jealousy, like someone gets more likes or someone gets a badge or whatever. I try to go recognize it, celebrate them, and for some reason that is on my best days, Thomas, remind you, I'm trying to use that as a trigger. And I've learned if I can use that as a trigger, and it actually takes a little bit of the power out of it. I don't know, any thoughts on that? Turn this into a therapy session here, Thomas. So thank you.
No, it's really interesting you say it, because I mean in the book I try and reflect on, because I was one of the first users of Facebook, you see, and as I say, I know what it was about originally because I was there at the very beginning, and it was about like. I mean, honestly, you would log in with a sense of trepidation because you were worried about like what somebody's tagged you in the night before. So you're like, oh my god,
what's a poke? You said,
yeah, and then there's pokes and all sorts of things. So, but now it's almost completely opposite. Right. Like you worry if you're not getting attention,
right.
Like that you're somehow worthless or nobody cares. And so social media's fundamentally changed in ways that I think we're still coming to terms with or getting to grips with. And like you say, there's so many trigger points in there now because we're so worried about sharing something and not feeling like, oh, that didn't land. And I've got to delete that then, or maybe I need to tweak it or iterate it. And instead of just doing, using social media like, oh, here's this great thing that I'm creating, or here's these ideas that I want to share, or like, and not worrying about at the reception or the fire emoji or whatever
right.
thing, but actually just doing it because you want to share with the world something.
Right.
Though that's, as I say, that's a very healthy way to use it. But if you're using it for validation and you're using those engagement as validation tokens to make you feel like you're good enough, like to bolster your self-esteem, that's obviously a not very healthy way to use social media.
Starting to spiral, yeah. So let's assume that most of us listening to discussion struggle with one or more of these dimensions, probably more than we realize. What's something specific we could do to join you on this journey of fighting back against these forces? And let's say I'm going to ask you here about the personal side of things, and then I'll ask you about as managers and as parents. But on the personal side, what can we do to start fighting back?
Oh goodness me! Well, first of all, to say there's no quick fix. Like there's no easy escape route. There's no off ramp. It's a journey, and the first thing is a very philosophical thing. This isn't a practical, actionable point, but it has helped me a lot in my outlook on life. And that's when you stop when you let things happen, when you let life happen to you, when you stop trying to push yourself into the world and happen in the world all the time, just let life happen. You do find it's remarkable, actually. It's not easy, but it is remarkable how things turn out in ways that aren't quite as catastrophic as you think they are. You're setting yourself in a direction, and you know where you want to go, but allowing things to happen, allowing things in, means that you can encounter setbacks much easier. You can know that there's going to be times when things are against you, and that's okay. There's going to be times when you might even stand still, and that's also okay. And there's going to be times when you're going to get a bit of luck or whatever, and that combined with your hard work is going to propel you forward. And this is just kind of that, instead of constantly thinking that I always have to be motoring ahead, and actually just allowing sometimes to let the flow of life happen, is been so crucial for me. It's really has allowed me to take setback, challenge, difficulty in a lot more compassionately, a lot more reflectively, and I think I've been more successful. It's remarkable, really. I've been a lot happier, and I've been way more successful when I've just allowed things to happen. Don't fall into that trap of trying to be competitive, trying to push past and lift yourself above everyone. Just you're on your own course. And it's going to go as fast as it's going to go. And you're going to get there on a timeline that's unknown. But as long as you're making progress, as long as you keep putting one foot in front of the other, that is the most important thing. So I know that's a very philosophical thing, but it's really something that's helped me a lot. And then on a more practical note, well, within that broad philosophy, what can we do? Well, I think the first thing is to, at all times, give ourselves a pat on the back and show ourselves kindness and self-compassion rather than self-criticism and castigation. And you can do this in a number of ways, but the first thing, the most important one, is to, whenever you recognize that something has gone wrong, let's say you're given a bad presentation, or if there's been some feedback on a project that wasn't particularly positive, or even, you publish a book and you get a 1-star review, which happens, by the way.
Hypothetically here.
In those moments, don't go in on yourself. Don't think about it all night and into the next day. Ruminate. Don't do those things. See them as reinforcements that you tried, that you put yourself out there, that you showed up, that you did something, you gave it to the world, and unfortunately on this occasion, it didn't quite go as well as you planned. But actually, the very act of pushing it out there requires a sense of pride, a sense of satisfaction, never mind how it turned out. And then the second thing is to make sure that you don't go in on yourself, and that you treat yourself with kindness. So as well as reflection, you say, that's okay, don't worry. It's not the end of the world. It's not as catastrophic as you think it is. This hasn't ruined your life chances. It's just a bad day at the office. So self-compassion is really, really important. And thirdly, it's so crucial to try to break through this kind of black and white thinking that perfectionists engage in all the time. So they'll think on all times that they must do this, I have to do that, I should do this, and unless I do, then it's not worth doing at all.
Yeah.
And this is very sort of black and white thinking that perfectionistic people engage in, and I myself have fallen into this trap too. So make sure that whenever those thoughts are coming into your mind, don't repress them, don't listen to them, most importantly, because then you won't get stuff done. But actually write them down. What is it that's is this a realistic belief? Is it a must, or is it would like to? And how catastrophic is it if I don't do this? What are the consequences? And if you really think about those feelings and those thoughts, then you can begin to build up a list of priorities of things that are important, things that aren't important, and you can streamline and begin to manage your activities, tasks, things that you need to get done in much more manageable ways, as opposed to feeling like you've got to do everything right now at this moment. And if you don't, you're going to be a failure. So I think those things are super, super important. And also finally, procrastination is so difficult. And research shows that if you start something, you're more likely to finish it. So give yourself very small chunks of time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever it might be, and give yourself a target and just do it. Goodness, just get it started. Just get something on the paper. It doesn't matter if it even goes into the final copy. Getting something started means you are way more likely to finish it, and giving yourself set, strict time slots with which to do it is so important for perfectionists. So there's a lot of stuff there, but those are the things that I've used.
Chapters, actually, so you handled that really well. What about the managers listening to us? Because we have a growing number of perfectionists entering the workforce. So what's something that we might be able to do as managers to help them?
So there will be a lot of perfectionist people in the workforce, and I'm sure the managers listening will probably be able to recognize a lot of themselves and their colleagues in what we've been discussing. Just like it is for the individual, it's really important to show kindness or compassion. And you've got to remember the people that you've hired for a reason. That's so important first and foremost, because they have competency, skills, and that are going to add value to your organization. That's the first thing. So trust them. Trust them. And show them that this is a safe environment, that it's okay to slip up. No question is a stupid question. That there's a sense of safety here, because that's so important. Once that safety is compromised, people feel like they're under surveillance. Then lines of communication break down. When people make mistakes, they don't bring them to the table, and that can have significant knock-on impacts for the end product of whatever we're creating or developing. So that sense of safety, that environment of openness and clear lines of communication is so important, not just to help break through those perfectionistic feelings of being a failure and falling short, which your colleagues will feel if they're perfectionistic people, but also when it comes to performance and team cohesion and team harmony. These things are so crucial. So try, if you can, to not create those highly pressurized competitive cultures, but instead open cultures where there's a supportive environment and people feel like they can fail and make mistakes, and it's okay.
Because they might just be assuming that manager expects perfection, right?
Yeah.
Without even being stated, right? But they just assume that might be the case. So, finally, what about parents? What are some lessons that parents can take away from your research? And once again, you've got at least a chapter and sprinkled with more than that, but a thing or two based on your research to positively influence our kids as much as we can.
Yeah, this is so important. First and foremost, it's really difficult to be a parent in the modern world. So complete compassion, complete empathy for parents, because there's so much pressure on young people. And I think it's inevitable that parents feel that pressure and pass it on too. It's so difficult to get into the elite colleges, which gain access to the elite professions. And by the way, the elite professions are the only jobs right now where wages are tracking above inflation. If you want to be a teacher or a doctor or a nurse or whatever, your living standards have been declining and will continue to decline, sadly. That's the economy we live in. So there's so much pressure to get into a very narrow set of professions, and which require exceptional results. This is just the way it is, and unfortunately, in that kind of society, parents are going to naturally respond by translating that pressure. But I just want parents to know that that's completely normal, completely natural, completely inevitable. Don't hold yourself over coals for that at all. But there are a couple of things, as I say, within this context of pressure that we can do as parents. First is to recognise it, first and foremost, and try where we can to diminish some of the power of the expectation that young people are going to feel. And we can do that in a couple of ways. First, we can show unconditional support to our kids. So no matter how well they've done on any particular occasion, it's important to show them love, approval, validation, to let them know that the way that they're treated and the way that you show affection is not contingent on the outcomes of those activities. So if they've done well, praise them, give them a hug, tell them how amazing they've done and how hard they've worked. But if they haven't done quite so well, do exactly the same thing. And try to reduce the power of that failure that they're going to feel. They're going to feel so much guilt about that, so much apprehension, so much worry. Try to take that off them. Tell them, this is just one result of many different results that they're going to do across. Sadly, they're going to do many, many different tests. So this is just one of many. It's not an indictment on them. Doesn't tell them anything about whether their teacher likes them or whether their parent approves of them. There's always next time. And don't worry about this being something that has any impact at all on the way that they should feel about themselves. And I think that's so important. That unconditionality of regard helps really break down those that need for approval that young people feel. And secondly, try where you can to recognize and turn down the volume on your own perfectionism, because young people are very impressionable creatures. If they see perfectionistic tendencies in their parents, they tend to model those parents and shoot for those same standards themselves. It's the same with anxiety and anxious forms of rearing, which are also very closely correlated with perfectionism. If you yourself are very failure averse, if you yourself are worried about whether you're looking or appearing or performing perfectly, then again, young people will pick up on that and start to internalize that as types of ways of interacting with the world that will then take on too. So it's about trying to, where you can, recognize your own perfectionism and provide unconditional love and support. And those are the two things that are so important when it comes to perfection.
Yeah. So many good things in there for parents, for all of us. For those listening, this is a book that surprised me in so many ways. It's challenged my thinking for sure, but it's already changing some behaviors. I strongly recommend you get a copy of Thomas Curran's new book, The Perfection Trap. I put links to the book and the book's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Thomas, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thank you for having me, Andy.